G'day, how are you? And over the last couple of years I've been learning a lot about photography, and one of the things that's been sitting in the background is the matter of exposure compensation. It's this little dial here on this particular camera, and it's also on your DSLR camera, the setting exposure compensation. Now, I have and I do use exposure compensation. The mode I usually run my camera in is AV or aperture priority, and I often use exposure compensation in that mode to adjust the brightness or the darkness of the image. That is the function of exposure compensation. Essentially, you're telling your camera to reset its own assessment of where the zero is. Your camera is evaluating the scene and working out where it thinks the best exposure is, and by adjusting the exposure compensation, you're telling the camera to either make that image lighter or make the image darker by adjusting where it believes that central 0 point is. So it's a little bit confusing. What is exposure compensation doing? And naturally it's only doing one of the three things: adjusting the ISO, adjusting the aperture, or adjusting the shutter. The question came to me is, why would we use exposure compensation when we can simply manipulate the settings to do one of those three things anyway? For instance, instead of adjusting the exposure compensation, why don't I just close down the aperture a bit to make the image darker? Or why don't I open the aperture a bit to make the image brighter? Or conversely, why don't I accelerate the shutter speed to make the image darker, or slow it down to admit more light into the camera and make the image brighter? It seems almost as though the fact that you can adjust the settings yourself makes the whole point of exposure compensation redundant and of no beneficial factor to the camera. But then it came to me, and in reality the solution is much more simple than it seems. Stay tuned. Okay, well, why don't we have a look at this? And the question again is, why would we use the exposure compensation dial or setting when we can simply adjust the fundamental setting anyway, namely the aperture, the shutter, or the ISO? Initially, at first glance, it seems that exposure compensation is redundant or is a superfluous feature that you don't need, given that you can adjust the settings manually. But in actual fact, really is quite beneficial, and it all depends on what mode you're shooting in. Now, for starters, if you're shooting in full auto mode, everything's green, you have very little control over the camera, and therefore exposure compensation is not an option available to you. But if we flick into the P mode, or the program automatic exposure mode, what happens then is the camera allows you to have control over the ISO, and it retains control over the shutter speed and the aperture. Now, when you're metering the scene and the camera determines what it believes the proper exposure is for you, at that point you can use exposure compensation to make the image lighter or to make the image darker. And when you use that, the camera is then making those adjustments by adjusting either the aperture or the shutter speed, and it's going to want to keep you within a reasonable shutter speed so you can get a good image. So in that point it may preference adjusting the aperture, but using the exposure compensation dial when you're in P mode allows the camera to make adjustments to the aperture diameter and the shutter speed, contrast with its own assessment of what the scene assesses as for the zero exposure. Okay, that's a little bit confusing, but let's have a look at it if we move into time value or shutter priority mode. Now, in this particular mode, you as a photographer have control over the shutter speed, and also you can set the ISO. At this point, for instance, if you're taking the image and you decide you want that image to be brighter or darker, you can of course adjust the shutter speed. But of course then you've got issues around movement or blurring of the image, depending on whether that time value is going to be suitable for the image you want to create. So by using the exposure compensation dial to either lighten or darken the image, the camera is now going to affect the aperture. The camera is now going to affect the aperture value because it knows you have control over the shutter and you have control over the ISO. So in order to lighten or darken the image, it is going to adjust the aperture for you. Now, if you're in shutter priority or time value mode, that's one thing that you can't do. You don't have control over the aperture. The camera retains control of that. So by using the exposure compensation dial, you wrest some of that control back. Okay, so let's also look at aperture priority mode, or AV. Now, in this mode, you have control over the aperture diameter value, and you also have control over the ISO, but you don't have any control over the shutter speed. So you can set the aperture if you want to open it wide open so you can blur the background or perhaps make use of some low light conditions, or you can stop that aperture down if you want to bring everything into focus or make that landscape crystal clear, or you've got exceptionally bright conditions and you want to be able to make a good exposure, but you have no control over your shutter speed. So you're going to be able to control your depth of field and the amount of light your lens admits onto the sensor within the time of that shutter that the camera automatically assesses, but you can't manipulate the shutter speed directly. The only way you can do it, and you're probably picking up on this by now, is to use the exposure compensation dial or setting in your camera. So by setting your aperture, and perhaps you would like to shoot wide open so you can blur the background and really make that subject pop, but the conditions might be too bright in terms of how the camera's assessing the scene, so you can darken the image by using your exposure compensation. And what that's going to allow you to do while you're on aperture priority mode is essentially manipulate the shutter speed, which you have no other way of doing in AV mode. Okay, so before we move on to manual mode, let's just recap quickly. In program automatic exposure mode, or P mode, you as a photographer are able to set the ISO value and the camera sets the aperture diameter and the shutter speed. By using the exposure compensation, you're allowing the camera to use one of those two fundamentals to adjust the image to the correct brightness setting that you're looking for. In shutter priority or time value mode, you have, as the photographer, control over the shutter speed and the ISO. And by using the exposure compensation, you are essentially manually adjusting the aperture diameter value, which, if not for that, only the camera would have control of. And if we go into aperture priority mode, now you as the photographer have control over the aperture and the ISO value, but the camera controls the shutter speed. By using the exposure compensation plus or minus, you are essentially taking back some of that control of the shutter speed and telling the camera where to set it 0. Okay, well hopefully that's clear as mud now. Now let's talk about manual mode, but before we do, the one thing you'll notice with DSLR cameras is that your exposure compensation meter comes up in this area here, and you're able to manipulate it using the red dial. It's also on the top deck display. Now, when you flick to manual mode, that's no longer exposure compensation, this is your light meter. So it's metering to tell you where the ideal exposure is. Naturally, in manual mode, you have control over the ISO, the aperture, and the time value, which means that the camera cannot control any of those three fundamentals without your input, which means the exposure compensation ceases to exist and then becomes a light meter, which you individually manipulate your settings to get the exposure that you want. Well, it's not exactly the shortest explanation, and while at first glance the answer seems very complicated and convoluted, once I started to boil it down I realized it was actually very, very simplistic. And essentially what you're doing by using exposure compensation in P mode, TV mode, or AV mode, you're simply telling the camera how to manipulate the setting or settings that it has retained control over. In manual mode, it doesn't exist at all. Before I sign off, thanks a lot for watching. I'm not one of these high-flying YouTube channel meisters that's getting sponsored and running videos every day and that sort of thing. I'm just a local, lowly photography enthusiast trying to learn a thing or two about photography and hoping to share it with you too. So have a great day and get out there and take some photos.